The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Glory to you, O Lord. Jesus said to his disciples, "A rich man had a steward who was reported to him for squandering his property. He summoned him and said, 'What is this I hear about you? Prepare a full account of your stewardship, because you can no longer be my steward.' The steward said to himself, 'What should I do now that my master is taking the position of steward away from me? I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. I know what I shall do, that when I am removed from the stewardship, they may welcome me into their homes.' He called in the master's debtors one by one. To the first he said, 'How much do you owe my master?' He replied, 100 measures of olive oil.' He said to him, 'Here's your promissory note. Sit down and quickly write one for 50. Then to another the steward said, 'And how much do you owe?' He replied, 100 cores of wheat. The steward said to him, 'Here is your promissory note. Write one for 80. And the master commended that dishonest steward for acting prudently. For the children of this world are more prudent in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. I tell you, make friends for yourself with dishonest wealth, so that when it fails, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. The person who is trustworthy in very small matters is also trustworthy in great ones, and the person who is dishonest in very small matters is also dishonest in great ones. If, therefore, you are not trustworthy with dishonest wealth, who will trust you with true wealth? If you're not trustworthy with what belongs to another, who will give you what is yours? No servant can serve two masters. He will either hate one and love the other, or be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and mammon." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
The normal practice at this time is to focus on the gospel, and that's pretty much what we do every week, and that's probably a pretty good thing to do. But once in a while, just to make sure that we don't fall asleep in the process of adhering to a routine that never has broken, never has any variation, we switch. So today we're actually going to focus on the second reading, which is taken from the first letter of St. Paul to Timothy. It is a letter in which Paul is, for the most part, is giving Timothy advice on how to fulfill the obligations of the task that Paul has left him as he has appointed Timothy to kind of conduct affairs of a local church. In some ways, the Apostle Paul has appointed his associate Timothy to be the bishop of this church. Timothy's a very young man and not really much experienced in this, and so most of the letter is Paul giving him advice as to what to do, how to do the job, what you should pay attention to, what you should give special care to. And in this part of the letter, Paul's making it clear that his job as overseer, as bishop of this church, is not simply one of administration, nor is it simply one of preaching. It is also leading and guiding prayer. And there's one specific kind of prayer that Paul is recommending here, and that is, as he says, prayer and supplication and petitions and thanksgiving have to be offered for everyone, to be sure, but especially for kings and all who are in authority, so that we may lead a quiet and tranquil life in all devotion and dignity. Everybody deserves prayers, and the Christian community has to pray for everybody. But there is a special group of people that needs prayer and therefore should be uppermost in their minds. Because what we really need is, as he says, a quiet and tranquil life so that we can go about our business in all devotion and dignity. The business of the church is always to proclaim the gospel. The church is not a club that is concerned only with her own members and promoting her own members. She really exists for those who are outside of her membership roles. The church exists to be of service to the world. And if the church is going to do that, if the church is going to be able to fulfill her mission in the world, she needs peace. She basically needs to be left alone. And therefore, prayer has to be offered for kings and all in authority that they will leave us alone, that they will let us live quiet and tranquil lives so that we can do our business. These writings of St. Paul, like all of the writings in the Scriptures, are given to us not as history lessons. Their purpose is not simply to show us the way things were a long time ago in a place far away from most of us. They are given to us precisely because their relevance remains. And therefore, if we are going to do a quick translation of what Paul is saying, taking it out of his era and his place and putting it in ours, then we need to ask ourselves whether these kinds of prayers are still needed. Whether, in fact, we have entered a new and better place where there is never any need for this kind of thing and never any worry that maybe something will go wrong in this respect, or whether, in fact, we are still in a situation where these kinds of prayers are essential, where we still need to pray that we will be able to lead a quiet and tranquil life, doing the work that the Lord has given us to do. And if we're going to ask that question, I suppose we could start with ourselves. How is it with us? How is it with us even right now, right here? And I think the answer for that is that our situation is indeed pretty good. That, in fact, there is no impediment, there is no obstacle, there is nobody who is giving us any kind of a hassle for what we are doing right here and now. Freedom of worship is not exactly the whole of the freedom of religion that is spelled out, that is mentioned, first of all, in the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, but let's face it, freedom of worship is a big part of it. And therefore, it is a good thing, a very good thing, that there is no impediment to that. Nobody who is here this morning was hassled on their way here. Nobody tried to prevent us from coming here. Nobody tried to stop us from coming together in this place to pray in the proper way that we see fit. On that score, we are indeed leading quiet and tranquil lives. People are leaving us alone. There is no problem. There is no difficulty. On that score, we are doing pretty well. But of course, that's not the only score. If that were the only thing, then maybe we could say that Paul's specific message is a little obsolete. We don't have kings anyway, but we do have presidents, we do have governors, we do have legislatures and judges and a police force and all of those things that are referred to and caught up in Paul's other phrase, people in authority. We got lots of people in authority. There are lots of people who have certain positions, and in general, with regard to freedom of worship, none of them is in our way. None of them poses a problem. None of them offers any kind of an obstacle to us. But when we move beyond just thinking about freedom of worship, then it becomes a little more complicated and a little more interesting, and perhaps a little more of a situation in which what Paul is asking Timothy to do on behalf of the whole church does come into play. That there are matters of concern, there are matters of worry. Because after all, doing the work that Christ has given us to do has never been understood in the church as simply a personal, individual obligation. It is an obligation that is laid on the entire community, and the entire community is a lot more than just a mass of largely disconnected and uncoordinated individuals. From the very beginning, it has been understood that if the church is going to do her work, she has got to bear witness and put into practice the dual commandment of love that she received from the Lord. To love God with everything that we have, with all of our strength, with all of our heart, and with all of our mind. I suppose freedom of worship is at the top of that. And to love our neighbor as ourself. And the love of neighbor has to express itself in action. And again, not just the actions of unconnected individuals, but actions that are worthy of a true community. People who live together, who share the same vision, who understand the same commandments, and who organize themselves to be more effective in the carrying out of that command. It has always been understood and has always been a part of the life of the church that there is a kind of necessary institutional footprint, a kind of an organizational approach to putting into practice the command of love of neighbor. We see this even in the New Testament, even in the book, The Acts of the Apostles, that fifth book that follows the four Gospels. Early in the history of the church, the apostles are still all gathered there in Jerusalem. There is a kind of an organizational thrust. And we see the apostles, this is the origin of the entire order of deacons. The apostles are approached with problems in organizing the welfare, organizing the contributions that are to be made to widows and orphans. And so the apostles, who certainly put a high priority on this and want to make sure it's done, but who do not think that they should be doing it themselves, they get 7 men that are put forward, nominated by the community. They are prayed over, hands are laid on them, and they become the first deacons, and their primary job is taking care of the poor, especially the most vulnerable of the poor in those days, those who are widowed and those who are orphaned. And that then begins something that continues and grows throughout the life of the church. If we take a look at what the church does after she comes out of the catacombs, after the time of persecution is over, one of the first things that we see is a growth and an organization of that institutional footprint. Again and again, in diocese after diocese, throughout the entire church, east and west, you see the bishops paying special attention to the sick and to those who are poor. And so they organize it. They create the first hospitals. Odd as it sounds to us to hear it these days, the hospital is originally a Christian invention. Of course, there was medical care and medical education long before Jesus appeared, but it was largely a personal thing. An individual would get the training he would need and then would sell his services, provide the services to those who could pay for it. And if you were poor, if you were indigent, there was not much that you were going to get except maybe the occasional attention of an unusually charitable or generous physician. The church changes that and creates and builds buildings in which the poor and the sick can be housed and can receive the care that they need. And those places also then become, obviously, great training grounds for future physicians. Hospitals and poorhouses and collections for the poor, all of that is a very big part of what the church does in those first centuries. So much so that's the Roman emperor who tried to restore paganism, who tried to suppress Christianity and roll back the clock and make the Roman Empire once again a purely pagan enterprise, recognized that it was simply impossible to go back to the way the things were before Christianity appeared. And that the new improved paganism that he was promoting, it needed to take care of the poor and the sick the way the Christians did. That people's attitudes, their mentality had changed. And if paganism was going to get traction, again, it would have to borrow that from the Christians. Fortunately, Julian the Apostate didn't get very far. He died young and never really had much success in his restoration of paganism. But in acknowledging what the Christians were doing, he was in a sense paying homage to that institutional footprint, that very well and important way of organizing things so that the poor would be taken care of and so that the sick would receive the care and the treatment that they need. And that continues to be a part of Christianity, the main part, perhaps, of what we do. We are not simply a people who gather on a Sunday morning to worship and to pray in a certain way. We are a people who do certain things in a way that makes a difference in the world. We create those institutions and promote those kinds of activities that make it possible to reach out to a much wider group of people than could ever be reached out if all of us were simply on our own, individually doing what little we could to put into practice the commandment of love. And on that score, we can and must ask the question whether or not things are as good in that part of our mission as they are with regard to our freedom to worship. And for that, I suppose we could ask ourselves, some of us are perhaps pretty well informed about what is going on in the world, or we could go to the people who really are the experts. We don't have to go very far. They're pretty close, actually. If you're really interested and want to talk to somebody whose answer maybe would be that things are not really as good as they could be or should be here, you just have to head a little bit east. You get on 20, you get on what becomes 2, and before too long, you're in South Bend, Mishawaka. You go to Mishawaka, and there you will find, of course, the mother house of the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration. They run Franciscan Health. They run Franciscan Alliance. They are the big healthcare providers in our neck of the woods. You can hardly throw a rock around here without hitting some office or some urgent care center or some major hospital that is under the aegis, that is under the umbrella of Franciscan Alliance, Franciscan Health. And if you knock on the door of their mother house, and if you have enough time, and if you connect with the right sister, you will get an earful that indeed prayers do need to be offered for those who are in authority so that they will leave us alone and let us lead tranquil lives, because the lives of the sisters and their Franciscan Health Alliance has been anything but tranquil over the last 10 years. 10 years ago, more or less, there were directives that came out of the federal government, the Department of Health and Human Services, demanding that all hospitals that receive federal money in any way, through any conduit, have to provide a set of services. And on that set of services were things that the Sisters of St. Francis of Perpetual Adoration and any Catholic hospital are going to have problems doing. In fact, they're going to have to outright refuse. Things having to do with abortion, things having to do with contraception, and perhaps more recently and more in the news these days, things having to do with the appropriate, or what was considered to be, is considered to be the appropriate treatment of those who have gender dysphoria, the whole transgender thing. Surgical interventions and pharmacological intertreatments that are, their purpose is basically to take a biological male and make him female, or to take a biological female and to make her into a male. And for all of these things, the sisters, of course, said, we can't do that. It's not just a question of our personal preference. It's not just a question of our own opinion. This is the teaching of the Church, that in all of those things, we are not able to cooperate. We are not able to go along with that. And therefore, they filed suit. This is 10 years ago. Lawsuits tend to last a long time in this country, and this one has gone on for a very long time. It was in the news just a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago. They received some temporary relief from a local court, federal court here in the Midwest, but the lawsuit is still not resolved and is still going on. And so you ask them how things are going and whether kings and those who are in authority are allowing them to lead tranquil lives, to do the work that they have been given to do in the way that it must be conducted. Their answer is not hardly, not quite. It is not that these institutions are being dismantled or that people are being led off to jail, but certainly their mission is compromised if they are going to follow the directives, if they are going to go along with that. If you don't want to head east and ask somebody, you could head west and head up, crossing the state line, into our ecclesiastical jurisdictional neighbor, the Archdiocese of Chicago. And there you will find several large institutions that are run by the Little Sisters of the Poor. And you can ask them the same question that you asked when you headed the other direction, and you will get pretty much the same answer. It has not been an easy time for them either. The same directives apply to them, and the same difficulties are faced by them, and the same legal problems and lawsuits are also something that has become a part of their lives as well. And so when we ask the question about what is going on with what Paul is talking about, the answer is kind of not clear. In some ways, we are in this country very free and very able to do what Paul tells Timothy is necessary, to lead the lives of tranquility and quiet so that we can go about our business of witnessing to Christ and proclaiming and living the gospel. But in other aspects, especially when they get to the institutional, larger organizational efforts of the church to be an effective force for the gospel in the world, it's not so clear that we are being left alone. It is not so clear that things are going well. And of course, the purpose of this is really not to promote conflict. It is really not to try and force people to do what we say would be the best thing to do. It is not a case that our interest is primarily in forcing others to bend according to our will. On that score, we can take a page out of a letter from another Christian writer that is on the scene about 130, 140, 150 years, we're not quite sure, after St. Paul wrote his letter. The letter to Diognetus, and no, we don't know the author of the letter to Diognetus, lays out in very good detail what our role is as Christians in a world that is largely not Christian. What our role is, as he says, is not to separate ourselves from the world, to create our own society, to have our own geographical place and our own set of customs, our own special way of dress, or our own special laws, or anything like that. No, he says. Christians live in the normal way in the places where they are. As he says, they dwell in their own countries, but simply, and as travelers. As citizens, they share in all things with other people, and yet they endure all things as if they were foreigners. Every foreign land is to them as their native country, and every land of their birth is as a land of strangers. They fit in everywhere. They don't stand out either by their speech or their manner of dress or by strange and peculiar customs. They fit in everywhere, and yet they don't fit in perfectly everywhere. Even in their own native country, they are kind of like pilgrims and strangers. They do not give total and complete allegiance to their own country because they know that they have a heavenly homeland. They know that their true and deepest allegiance is to God and the gospel of his Son, Jesus. And that does not make, the letter goes on to say, that does not make for conflict. It does not have as its purpose creating division. On the contrary, as I said earlier, the church exists for those who are not members of the church. Later on in the letter, the writer says, to sum it all up in one word, what the soul is to the body, Christians are in the world. The soul is dispersed through all the members of the body, and Christians are scattered through all the cities of the world. The soul dwells in the body, yet is not of the body. And Christians dwell in the world, yet are not of the world. The flesh, the body, hates the soul and wars against it. The soul loves the flesh that hates it, and Christians likewise love those that hate them. God has assigned them this position which it were unlawful for them to forsake. Even though we may experience opposition and difficulty, we are here for the sake of others. We do not separate ourselves from them. We do not say, to hell with this, and stomp off in anger to live our own isolated lives in communities that are cut off and separate from the larger human family. We are there for them, as the soul is there for the body. And even if at times the body rebels against the soul and puts up opposition to what the mind wants, nevertheless, the mind, the soul, continues in its love for the body and its service to that body. We believe in our heart of hearts that by being faithful to the gospel of Christ, even if it conflicts in some ways with the modern popular way of looking at things and with modern medical ethics and modern medical values, it still is a good thing that we are here and bearing witness to that. Paul makes that very clear as he comes to the end of what he says, when he says that God wants all to come to salvation. God wants all to be saved, and that is our mission, to continue the work of Christ in our private witness and also in those large institutional footprints that the church has, especially in the areas of taking care of the sick and in providing help and necessary support for the poor. If we do that through our institutions, perhaps we will find ourselves at times in conflict, and perhaps there will be lawsuits. But we keep always in mind the purpose of this, which is not to force anybody to do anything, but to persuade, and to persuade as much by our witness in actions as by the words that we speak. That is why we are here. And that means that, yes, what Paul says that we should be doing, we have to continue doing. To offer prayers for kings and those in authority, and in this country there are no kings, and we know who we should be praying for. Those people who are in authority, elected officials for the most part, as well as government bureaucrats who are in charge of the system and the administration of its rules and its various commands. We pray for them exactly for what Paul said we should be praying for a quiet and tranquil life, so that we can go about our business, a business that is just as vital to the outside world, to the world that finds itself in opposition to us, as it is for ourselves. By being true to the gospel and true to our mission, we are actually doing the world a greater service than it knows, a greater and better work than it imagines.